Well, this really was the trial of Jesus, the most unjust trial in history. We looked last week at all of the guarantees in Jewish law that was set to favor the innocent. In the same way that our justice system in this country is set to favor the innocent, it would be better for a guilty man to go free in this life than for an innocent man to be punished. And so everything that we have in our justice system, everything that was established in the Jewish justice system was meant for just that point. Because there's a recognition in both cases that God knows all, God sees all, and that God will punish all. And it's better to let the guilty man go free in this life, knowing that he will be punished in the next, punished by God. And so we saw last week in the Jewish system of law that there were multiple guarantees, like the guarantee to a public trial. It had to happen in daylight hours. It had to happen in a public place where everyone could see and hear the testimony and hold accountable the judges who would render a verdict. There was a right to self-defense, that the individual accused of a crime could bring forward witnesses to their innocence. They could defend themselves in the court. There was the requirement that no one could be convicted without at least 2 credible witnesses, and that they had to agree on the time and the place and every part of the events of the supposed crime. There was the requirement further in death penalty cases for multi-day deliberations. A verdict could not be rendered on the same day that the case was brought. There had to be several days in between, a full day of fasting and prayer for all of the judges. All of these things to make it clear that those involved in this case had a weighty responsibility. And yet, as we will see, every aspect of this was not just ignored, but consciously contradicted. In fact, if we had just seen a mob coming into the Garden of Gethsemane, if we had seen this mob come in and arrest Jesus, grab Jesus, and just in a mob justice or a mob mentality, just take him to the nearest tree and lynch him, it would be less unjust than what we are going to go over this morning in the trial of Jesus. Instead, they go through the motions of a trial as an insult to justice itself, going against every aspect of jurisprudence, every aspect of what should have been in place to protect the innocent. And they make an active mockery of the system, an insult to justice. And this insult, as we again looked at last week and will continue to cover in the coming weeks, included both Jew and Gentile. Yes, the Jewish leaders were the ones actively looking for the death of Christ. They were the ones who arrested him, who brought up false charges against him, who tried him in this kangaroo court. But the Gentiles were just as responsible. More than enough opportunity for Pilate, the head of the Romans, and Herod, the head of the the secular Jewish court system, to declare Jesus innocent and require him to go free. And though they both recognized his innocence, they still allowed him to be condemned to death. Really, what we see is an inclusion of all peoples of the world. It was not just the Jews responsible for the death of Jesus, it was the world. This morning we're going to look at the trial of the Sanhedrin, the trial of Annas and of Caiaphas, the first 2 phases of the 3 phases of the Jewish trials, as we talked about last week. And I say the trial of the Sanhedrin because as much as they were putting Jesus on trial, it was really them who were shown for what they were. Made evident their corruption, their guilt while trying Jesus. But let's read our passage for this morning. Matthew chapter 26, verses 57 to 68. Those who had seized Jesus led him away to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the scribes and the elders were gathered together. But Peter was following him at a distance, as far as the courtyard of the high priest, and entered in and sat down with the officers to see the outcome. Now the chief priests and the whole council kept trying to obtain false witness against Jesus, but that they might put him to death. They did not find any, even though many false witnesses came forward. But later on, two came forward and said, "This man stated, 'I am able to destroy the temple of God and to rebuild it in 3 days.'" The high priest stood up and said to him, "Do you not answer? What is it that these men are testifying against you?" But Jesus kept silent, and the high priest said to him, "I adjure you by the living God that you tell us whether you are the Christ, the Son of God." Jesus said to him, "You have said it yourself. Nevertheless, I tell you, hereafter you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his robes and said, "He has blasphemed. What further need do we have of witnesses? Behold, you have now heard the blasphemy. What do you think?" They answered, "He deserves death." Then they spat in his face and beat him with their fists, and others slapped him and said, "Prophesy to us, you Christ. Who is the one who hit you?" For those of us who love Christ, this is difficult to read. Difficult because we see the unjust nature. We feel the pain of Christ, even if it is in a small way. Knowing that we would justly be accused, and Jesus, the innocent, standing in our place. And we see revealed in this the sin of man. But even before we can begin looking at our section here in Matthew, we have to back up a little bit. And I want to look for a time at the trial of Annas, who we talked about last week was the first phase of these trials. Before taken to Caiaphas and the rest of the high priests, Jesus was taken to Annas. And that is recorded for us in John chapter 18. So if you want to switch over there real quick, we're going to take a few minutes to look at this event, which reveals even more to us about what was going on. In John chapter 18, we're told that from the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus was first taken to Annas, who was the high priest, and he was taken with intent, arrested with intent. From the very beginning, he was arrested to be put to death. This was a public murder. A public murder by the governing forces. Those meant to protect life, those meant to protect innocence and punish the guilty, established from the very beginning that their point in arresting Jesus was simply to murder him. Now, how do we know this? Well, you can flip just a couple of pages back. And in chapter 11 of John, we read in verse 47, "Therefore, the chief priests and the Pharisees convened a council and were saying," we should stop right there for just a moment. Remember that the chief priests, or the Sadducees and the Pharisees, hated one another. They were constantly fighting, constantly bickering back and forth. The Pharisees were the religious, the conservatives in that sense, both politically and religious, and the chief priests were the Sadducees, a very liberal, both politically, in that they were licking the boots of the Romans and had been for many years. Before the Romans, the Greeks who were in charge, working themselves into their culture rather than protecting the Jewish culture, and religiously very liberal. They rejected most of what we know as the Old Testament, rejected many of the teachings that were common even in the Pentateuch, the first 5 books. They hated each other, were constantly at odds, and yet they convened a council together, saying, "What are we going to do? For this man is performing many signs." They recognized what Jesus was doing. They recognized his miracles. They knew what he was doing. They didn't deny that truth. But they continue in verse 48, "If we let him go on like this, all men will believe in him." They knew what was going to happen. They knew who Jesus was. All men will believe in him. And we have to stop that. And the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation. At the heart of all of this is a fear that they would lose their power. A fear that they would lose everything they had. Their position of authority over the people, their financial income, the riches they had gained through the skimming of the money from the temple. But one of them, Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year, said to them, "You know nothing at all, nor do you take into account that it is expedient for you that one man die for the people, that the whole nation not perish." Wrapped in false piety, claiming to work on behalf of the people, Caiaphas, from the very beginning, said, "We need to kill Jesus so that the people would be spared." Not the people in his mind, himself, his power, his authority, but still wrapping this murderous intent in piety. He still speaks the truth. In verse 51, God uses even this murderous statement. Now, he did not say this on his own initiative, but being high priest this year, he prophesied that Jesus was going to die for the nation. And not for the nation only, but that in order that he might also gather together into one the children of God who were scattered abroad. So from that day on, they planned together to kill Jesus. So, even taking Jesus to Annas, there was this intent to murder him, to use the systems of government that they had authority over to put Jesus to death, even though they knew they had no place to do it. There was no crime he was guilty of. And so they took him to Annas to find a crime, to come up with a crime. Now, this Annas was, as we talked about a little bit last week, the power behind the throne, so to speak. He was the one in charge of the bazaar of Annas, or all of the merchant activity that was happening in the temple that was stealing from the people, turning the temple of God that Jesus had accused them of into a den of robbers. And Jesus is brought before Annas in John 18. In verse 19 it reads, the high priest, this being Annas, then questioned Jesus about his disciples and about his teachings. You see, from the very beginning, they had nothing. And so Annas begins to question Jesus. Tell me what you've been teaching. What he's doing in this is fishing for an accusation. He needed a crime to convict him of. And so he gives him leeway. He wants to lay out the rope that he's hoping Jesus will hang himself with. If he knows that Jesus has been teaching against the Pharisees and their traditions, demonstrating so much of it to be against God's word, he knows that Jesus has been teaching against even the Sadducees, calling them usurpers, as we saw in Matthew chapter 23. As Jesus is publicly teaching against them in chapter 24, as they come to question his authority, and he calls the chief priests and the Pharisees usurpers who were stealing the place of God. But even in this, Annas needs something specific. So he says, tell me everything, and we'll find a problem. We'll find something to use against you. Something that we can claim as heresy or blasphemy. And Jesus reveals in this the obvious fallacy of the whole situation, answering him in verse 20, I have spoken openly to the world. I always taught in the synagogues and in the temple, where all the Jews come together and spoke nothing in secret. Why do you question me? Question those who have heard what I spoke to them, and they know what I said. You see, Jesus recognized the injustice of the whole situation. In the Jewish system, as we talked about last week, an individual couldn't condemn themselves. Their own testimony couldn't be used against them. You needed other witnesses. So Jesus lays this corruption out openly and clearly. But beyond that, he says, look, if you had witnesses, if you had a problem with my teaching, if there was something that you can convict me of, I never taught in secret. I never held anything back. Everything I taught every day in the temple, in the synagogues, where everyone was gathering, the place where these things are supposed to be taught. If there was any problem, you can scour all of Israel. There are many people who have heard my teachings, many people who could be witnesses, and yet you have nothing. In this is a clear accusation against Annas the high priest. You're either incompetent or you're corrupt. To even ask this question, you're either incompetent, you didn't do your homework, you didn't go find the witnesses, and there was a nation full of them. You didn't put in any legwork to find a single witness who could come against me, and there are many, or you know that there aren't any who could condemn me. You know of all of the witnesses, and that not a single one is going to accuse me of a crime, and so you are just corrupt. You are abusing the system of justice, looking for something, looking for me to condemn myself. Making it clear the guilt of Annas. And in response to this, because this is such an obvious rebuke, in verse 22, when he said this, one of the officers standing nearby struck Jesus, saying, "Is this the way you answer the high priest?" This officer turned to Jesus in response to Jesus' statement and just smacks him across the face. "How dare you speak this way?" Now, whether this was at a signal of Annas or this officer merely acting on his behalf, anticipating his will, which I'm sure was there, the innocent is abused. Out of frustration at his own failure, Annas has this officer beat Jesus, making all the more clear the unjust nature. Jesus responds to this officer, "If I have spoken wrongly, testify of the wrong. You just heard what I said. You're a witness of what I said. If there was something wrong in it, if there was a crime in it, then be the witness. What I said was perfectly accurate and true. So if I was wrong, then testify of it. But if I'm innocent, if rightly I spoke, why did you hit me? You didn't like what I said, but what I said was true, and you know it. And because you didn't like it, the only thing you could do was hit me." That's the picture of this whole trial. Nothing wrong in Jesus could be found. Even trying to get him to condemn himself. And out of frustration, they lash out in anger. Annas being corrupt, being the brains behind the whole system, still can't figure anything out. And being dressed down so clearly, and having nothing else to use against Jesus, he just sends him on his way. Sends him to Caiaphas, and that's where we find ourselves in Matthew. Being brought to Caiaphas, we have really just another replay of this, but in greater detail. As Jesus is brought to Caiaphas, the high priest, again, we see multiple unjust aspects of this. He's brought to Caiaphas, as we see with the statement about Peter following. before the first cock crowing. This would be before 4 a.m. So in the middle of the night, the dead of night, the point where most people would be asleep, even those late night owls, before even the early risers, everyone is asleep at this point. The dead of night, and brought to the house of Caiaphas, into his courtyard, away from the world, away from prying eyes, to be tried in the most unjust way possible. And it begins with false witnesses and the condemnation of false witnesses. And again, not condemnation of Jesus by false witnesses, but we see the opposite true. Jesus had spent 3 years openly teaching in the synagogues and in the temple, all over Galilee, all over Judea. His actions and his teachings widely known and viewed by everyone in the nation. And yet, no witnesses, no true witnesses could be brought to any false or any crime he had committed. Instead, they rely on false testimony. We read from the other Gospels that these false witnesses were bribed by the very Sanhedrin who was putting Jesus on trial. The judges bribing false witnesses to come up with a crime so that they could convict Jesus. And what makes this even worse is that in verse 60, they did not find any, even though many false witnesses came forward. Even lying about Jesus, they couldn't come up with a crime to convict him of. Now, how could that be true? One of them might have just said, if they gotten a few of them together, that he had said something or done something. They could have come up with, if they're planning these things together, you would think they could come up with something. But the fact that there was absolutely nothing that they could even come up with, even imagine, even lie about that could convict Jesus just shows the evil and the guilt of all those involved in this trial. Condemns the false witnesses, their inability to even come up with a lie. Condemns the Sanhedrin who had bribed them. All of this proves the innocence of Jesus all the more. That even lying, they couldn't come up with something that would stick. How pure, how perfect do you have to be that even a bribed false witness couldn't make anything stick? And there is in this as well the inconsistency of evil. Not even giving false testimony against them could they be consistent. In fact, that's exactly what Mark says in his account of this same event. In chapter 14, verse 56, for many were giving false testimony against him, yet their testimony was not consistent. Evil, by its very nature, is inconsistent. Cannot work. Cannot move from one point to the next without problems. A lie is always so much harder to maintain. Finally, though, two men have something of a corroborating story. 3 years before this, Jesus had sat in the temple and taught about who he was. And this half-remembered teaching by these false witnesses gets jumbled up into the statement as two witnesses come forward in verse 61, saying, this man stated, I am able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days. In Mark's testimony, it is a little bit different, because this other witness says, this man stated, I am able to destroy the temple and rebuild it with my own hands. Even in this, they couldn't be consistent, and they were far from the truth. Jesus didn't say that. What he had told them in John chapter 2, verse 19, destroy this temple, referring to himself, and in 3 days I will raise it back up. Again, referring to his body, making clear his resurrection, not the temple building. In this, they both were inconsistent with each other and inconsistent with the truth. Not only that, but this was pointless because no law in the Jewish system could convict a man of something he could claim to do. Whether or not Jesus claimed he could do this or not. Whether or not he claimed he could rebuild or he could destroy the temple and rebuild the temple itself in 3 days, though he could have. Even if he had said that, there was no crime there. Nothing to condemn him of. Merely the inconsistency of evil. Showing that these false witnesses couldn't get anything straight. And through all of this, hours of false witnesses, bribed witnesses being brought against Jesus, not a single response. Part of what they were trying to do was to get Jesus talking. They needed him to say something that they could hang him on. They were trying to goad him into defending himself, hoping that he would do something, say something, give them something to accuse him of. And yet through all of it, Jesus remained silent. We've seen over and over again how never could the Pharisees or the Sadducees come close to tricking Jesus. Knowing their hearts, knowing their schemes, having a wisdom beyond comprehension, Jesus knew what they were trying to do, and the more they tried, the more his silence revealed their hypocrisy. The more his silence revealed their guilt, the bribed false testimony, their hatred. His silence allowed them instead to condemn themselves all the more. And I think the more he remained silent, the more the hatred, the more the anger grew and grew. Finally, Caiaphas had had enough. The silence of Jesus. And I wonder, merely speculating, if through this whole thing Jesus sat looking at him. The eyes of Jesus peering straight into his soul. Looking past the lies, looking past the schemes, directly into the heart of stone. And I think Caiaphas, the anger, the frustration, and the boring eyes of Jesus just had enough. He had known the claims of Jesus. Maybe just suspected, maybe just rumors, but he had one last ace up his sleeve. One more thing to try to get Jesus to hang himself. And so in verse 63, he said, I adjure you by the living God. I call you to the highest oath that a Jew could make. This is the swearing on a Bible to the extreme. This is the highest form of oath. This is, I am putting you before the God who knows all, who sees all, requiring you to answer before God. Are you the Christ, the Son of God? Days before, Jesus had come into Jerusalem on the back of a donkey with the crowds calling out, Hosanna to the Son of David, celebrating Jesus as the Messiah. And when told to silence them, Jesus said, no. When told to silence the children who were saying the same things in the temple walls the next day, Jesus said, no. Making clear his claim. Not only that, but multiple times throughout the years of his ministry, he had made it clear who he was. Though he hadn't gone around announcing it, he hadn't gone around making a big deal of it, because he knew the response that would come. It was known who Jesus was. It was known because of his teachings, but it was also known because of his miracles. No one could do what Jesus did unless they were sent by God, unless they were anointed by God. But Jesus had even made that claim to the Pharisees and the Sadducees, those putting him on trial. When he answered them, before Abraham was, I am. And so the high priest finally draws this last attempt. I adjure you, I am putting you by your oath before the living God. Answer, are you the Christ, the Son of God? And Jesus, answering in truth, you have said it. As you say. But knowing exactly what was going to come next, he makes it clear the further truth. I tell you, hereafter you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. Why did he say that? Because he knew what was going to happen next. He knew the guilty verdict that was coming, even though his innocence. And he makes it clear in this statement, I am giving you the rope you want, even though it's true. And to make it clear, and to make sure that you know the truth that is coming, one day, you will see me sitting on the judgment seat. The right hand of power, meaning the right hand of God the Father. The seat of power, the seat of authority, next to God. I will stand in judgment over you when you see me coming on the clouds of heaven. And then in verse 65, blasphemy is revealed. The blasphemy of not Jesus, but the people, the Sanhedrin. Not just the leaders, but all of the people. The high priest then tore his robes and said, he is blasphemed. What further need do we have of witnesses? We don't even need to check out his story. We don't need to question whether or not he is. He said it and that's enough. Behold, you have heard the blasphemy. What do you think? And they answered, he deserves death. And then they spat in his face. They beat him with their fists, and others slapped him and said, prophesy to us, you Christ, who is the one who hit you? They had what they had come for. They had their guilty verdict. And so they blasphemed the living God. Spitting in his face. Smacking him around in jokes. We read in the other Gospels that they put a cloth over his head as they're doing this. Each one coming up in jest to smack Jesus, to spit in his face, to punch him, and say, well, if you really are a prophet, then prophesy. Who is it that hit you? Questioning God. The grossness of this blasphemy. The hypocrisy of it. In the face of blasphemy, the high priest and all of the priests were required to tear their robes as a physical symbol of the emotional pain that they were experiencing at the unjust statement, the insult to God that had just happened. And they do this at the statement of Jesus with a smile on their face. Not the blasphemy of Jesus being revealed here, but the blasphemy of the people, the blasphemy of the religious leaders and all who were there. You see, I think the reason why they didn't question Jesus' statement, they didn't question whether or not Jesus was the Christ, the Son of God, is because they knew he was. If they had thought Jesus wasn't the Messiah, then they would have brought some evidence forward to say, he can't be the Messiah because of this evidence. If someone today were to claim, I am Jesus, or I am Jesus reborn. And we've had many. The Moonies coming out of South Korea, the different groups like the Branch Davidians, David Koresh. We can come up with lots of different examples, both in the recent past and even in the present. Men who claim to be Messiah. How do we know that they're not? There's tons of evidence. It's not hard to lay out truths, both from Scripture and from their lives, to know they're not the Messiah. And if the Sanhedrin, the chief priests, the scribes, the Pharisees, these wisest men in Israel, thought he wasn't the Messiah, they would have proved it. But they never questioned it, because they were afraid of the truth. They were afraid to investigate whether or not he really was, because the truth would be all the more revealed. As we read in John chapter 11, they were afraid because of what he could do, what he was doing, the fact that no one could deny his miracles, no one could deny his teaching, this unquestionable wisdom, as they were silenced over and over again when they did try. You see, if he was allowed to be the Messiah, he had clearly condemned them many, many times, and they were afraid of losing everything. Since he is the Messiah, he has to die. This is the failing that shows the heart of those who hear truth and reject it. Many, when presented with the gospel, most in fact, when hearing the truth of the gospel being preached, being pronounced to them, feeling the tugging at their heart. That is one of the primary roles of the Holy Spirit in this world, to convict the world of sin. And when presented with the truth, when presented with the light, men fear that their imagined control over their tiny kingdom of their own heart is threatened. I say imagined control because those in sin are enslaved to sin. They have no control to begin with, but when the light of Christ is revealed, it makes them wither away. It is the exact point made by John in John chapter 3 in presenting the truth of the gospel to Nicodemus. Jesus, speaking to this man, this ruler of the people, a member of the Sanhedrin, presents Nicodemus with the truth of the gospel, the need to be born again. We all know that great verse, John 3:16, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, and whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life." But it doesn't end there. "For God did not send the Son into the world to judge the world, but that the world might be saved through him." And then in verse 19, this judgment, the judgment that comes against those who do not believe, this is the judgment that the light has come into the world, and men who love darkness rather than light, for their deeds were evil. For everyone who does evil hates the light and does not come to the light for fear that his deeds will be exposed. You see, men who hate light when it is revealed against them react in hatred, in anger against the source of that light. Some scurry off into the darkness, some lash out. And the great darkness in the hearts of these men was revealed as their hearts were put on trial before Jesus and their sin exposed. But he who practices the truth comes to the light, so that his deeds may be manifested as having been wrought in God. What are you going to do this morning? As your heart is being put before the light of Christ, do you respond in joy? The cleansing power of that light. A light that brings with it the righteousness of Christ as He takes our very sin. Or do you react in frustration when your sin is exposed? React in anger. Let's pray.